It's great. Great to have you all here. We'll get going in just one moment while everyone files into the room. I can see our participants as just passing 100.
That's good.
Great to have you all here. We'll start in just 1 minute. Okay. I think everyone who's going to join us at the moment is in fact here. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Great to have you here. A huge welcome to Property4Media's first ever webinar. I'm Henry Hemming, the CEO of the company, and it's a great pleasure to have you tuning in to this afternoon's broadcast. Today's event is going to be the first in a series of webinars that Property4Media is planning for the weeks and months ahead. I hope all of you are coping well, and those around you, and wishing everyone well at this time. We hope that the webinars that we run, which will be under the Property4Media Meets banner, will give you a chance to network, communicate, get vital information, and to have some sort of business continuity at this vital time. Today's topic, as you know, is coronavirus and its impact on the property sector. It's a thorny issue. We need to tackle it. It's affecting every minute of our waking and working lives. And I am delighted to have here today to help us tackle the impact of COVID-19, a really wonderful panel of preeminent property journalists from the UK, some of the very, very top names. And I will introduce them in just a moment. They'll be looking at how the sector is affected, what their predictions are for the impact on the whole sector and subsectors over the next couple of years, but more positively, how the sector might regain normality and bounce back once we get the all clear. Woven into their insights and predictions, we're also going to ask them to let us know how the epidemic has impacted the shape and content of their pages. And we also have the freelancers' view on that, how they're coping. And also for everyone in the room listening to us, we're hoping our panelists will give a bit of insight into how PRs can answer the media's insatiable demand for information at this time. So our panel for this first webinar is Helen Davies, property editor of the Times and Sunday Times; Nathan Brooker, deputy editor, FT Weekend, House and Home; Graham Norwood, freelance journalist and notably editor of Estate Agent Today; and then two of the UK's top other freelancers, Ruth Bloomfield and Nigel Lewis. And I'll tell you more about our panelists in turn as we introduce them in just a second. Turning to the audience, we're delighted to have received over 200 registrations for today's event. Our audience comprises PRs from across the sector, in-house, in-agency, specialist agencies. We've also got a fair sprinkling of wider industry executives joining us. You, our audience, will be able to post questions via Zoom. If you kind of cursor over the bottom toolbar, you will see an all-important Q&A button. That's where you can post your questions. When you post your questions, perhaps you could just end them with the name of the company you work for, because Zoom doesn't seem to include that. It just has your name. And I'll try to give a shout out to as many people as I possibly can during this webinar. So please participate. Please post questions. The more ingenious, the better. And I'll pitch them to our panel. We are also promoting a hashtag today of Property4Media Meets for this event, if you want to get busy on Twitter and the like. Finally, before we get going, Property4Media is open to ideas for future events in this Meet series, open to ideas for spokespeople, both from PR agencies and property brands who would like to come on as panelists and join us. So following today's webinar, get in touch with me, get in touch with the team if you've got ideas for webinars or people that you wish to put forward as speakers, because we will achieve a balance of media speakers and the PR speakers during this series. We're also doing these with our sister brands. We're going to be doing them with Trap Media, Homes for Media, and Food for Media. First up, if I may, I think as he is directly in front of me, I'll start with Graham Norwood. Graham Norwood, editor of Estate Agent Today, but very much a freelance, recognised writer for titles including The Mail, The Times, The Telegraph, but editor of 2 industry titles, Estate Agent Today and Letting Agent Today, and current Property Journalist of the Year at the Property Press Awards. He's been writing about residential property for 20 years, was at the BBC before that, and he's written many property-related books. Graham tells me he's coping with the lockdown by cooking, and his partner's putting his culinary creations on Instagram, and he's contributing to a local community website on great menus for the corona crisis. So he's channeling his inner Nigel Slater, he tells me. So Graham, would you give us from the heart your view on how you've been in property journalism many years? How is this epidemic going to impact the industry? How does it impact your working, and what's the route to return and recovery?
Henry, thanks very much, and hello to everybody who's watching. Thank you for joining in. I'll let my colleagues talk about the consumer side, because although I do write for some nationals as well, they're a much better place to cover it than I am. Let me talk about the industry side, which does have bearings on consumer-facing journalism as well. But most of my work is on Estate Agent Today and Letting Agent Today, and for the readers of those publications, this is very much an existential crisis, really, because many of those, and not only just the small estate agents and letting agents, but some of the big corporates as well, some of those are not in great positions to begin with. And the uncertainty and the uncertain duration of this crisis means that for them, this could be the difference between continuing and not continuing. So from that point of view, this is probably a much bigger event and crisis, much more uncertainty than we've had even during, for example, the credit crunch banking crisis just over a decade ago. So therefore, from the point of view of what I'm writing, oddly enough, what I'm writing in volume is much, much more than it was before the outbreak. We are trying to do quite a lot of guides for agents in terms of the employment laws, the various legislation that's been applied, how to furlough staff, some of the stuff which is deeply unsexy but extremely important for the industry at the moment. And also, as a result of that, we've had quite a big increase in the number of pages that stories that we do, and a really huge increase, as I suspect has applied across the industry press, but a really huge increase in the number of hits and reads we have. For those who aren't familiar, Estate Agent Today and Letting Agent Today are both completely online. So that's been a really, really big increase. So that's my perspective on it. How long it will be is difficult to tell. Clearly, for the next few months, there's going to be, at the very least, a diminished sales and lettings market. There's going to be an issue with whether or not people will physically be able to do the normal sorts of things with transactions. There are so many people involved that practical things like social distancing and so on will make that quite difficult. But when it comes out, I'm sure the industry will have a big bounce back for a short period of time. Much more important, much more difficult to tell is what's going to happen 3 months after the lockdown finishes. Whenever that finish is and however one defines that finish. The big thing will be what's going to happen in 3 months' time. How many estate agents will there be from the industry side? How much money they're going to have to advertise on the consumer press side? Whether or not there'll be an appetite for people to move house, whether they would have missed some of their benchmarks, like getting to the right catchment area for schools and getting to the right place for new jobs. So all of that is very much up in the air. But that's my take on it, and I hope to come back after my colleagues.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Graham. That's great. So I'm going to turn now to Helen Davies, the property editor at the Times and Sunday Times. And Helen, I hope you can hear me fine. And great to have you here. Could you give our audience your views on this crisis and what the shake-up will be?
A lot to answer. It's intriguing. People keep asking me, what more do we need to do? Has the commissioning process changed? And I just want to say, no, it's exactly the same. What is the story? What is relevant to readers? What is happening right now, and how best should we report it? So in that sense, that's absolutely the same. I agree with Graham. I think that the appetite that was demonstrated in the housing market in January and February and early March will still be there if the lockdown finishes and we are released into the wild at some point within the next couple of weeks. Any longer, it's going to get quite frightening. And I think we'll know a lot more when a 3-month mortgage holiday is up, just to quite how devastating this could be. So I'm going around that there is so much that is happening, and I think it's proof of how much the market itself had fractured before this happened. So there's lots to say about lots of different areas of the market. So as well as pent-up demand, there will be some very sorry losers, and we just have to see how long the lockdown lasts and how long this existential crisis will last, which isn't just estate agents, it's also within the media itself, which has been struggling and trying to find a new way of doing things.
Very good. And so during this existential crisis, I think we're clearly going to christen it that. You must be getting a lot of reach out from property PRs. How are they helping you at this time? How are they hindering you, and how can they get things right?
I'm not going to say anything about hindering. The question of that, it's very much like before. So, if I suppose it's just being very current, very real is what I've always asked for. What are you and your friends talking about? What are your family talking about? Yeah. Not just what does your company want you to promote, but like what is right and relevant right now? What is the right tone? So we're doing a big Q&A, and we'll run it every week in Bricks on Friday, and it's much longer online. And that's, trying to help readers through any point of the buying and selling process. My surveyor won't come round, or can I get by with a virtual surveyor? Waiting on cancel, waiting lists for schedules, where are they? And one of the biggest problems has been with moving firms, and their insurance and not being able to move. I think really the best thing with PRs is either to have an expert at the very top of their game that can help give you an insight plus constructive news as to what is happening. It's not an opinion piece, but genuine constructive news that will help people. And/or we want real people's stories. People really react to that now. The human has never been more important, and it's one way to really help readers through what is quite a scary time.
Okay, so thought leadership and real people's stories. There's a great pointer there from Helen. Okay, that's great. I'm going to come back to you on a couple of those in just a minute, Helen. Yeah, sorry, carry on.
I was about to say also virtual house tours.
Yeah, virtual house tours, very good. I think we're having a virtual tour of your house this afternoon.
Yeah.
Sorry
about that.
Good. Okay, so next up, I think Nigel. Nigel, can you hear me fine?
I can, yes, all good.
Great to have you here today, Nigel. So Nigel's been a journalist for 23 years, track record in national newspapers, online consumer magazine, writes for, as I'm sure our audience knows, The Negotiator, Daily Mail, Place in the Sun, and other titles. I'm going to say that during quarantine, he is now playing violin virtually. I hope he's going to play us the Four Seasons at the end of this webinar. He's reading the works of Graham Greene and doing lots of pub quizzes. He says he seems to be having more contact with people than ever before, which is so true of this, actually. It's lovely making contact with people online. So yeah. Nigel, as a top freelance writer, what is your take on the shape of this and how the property industry can ride it out and regroup? What are your thoughts?
Given the audience here this afternoon, I would say one main thing that has struck me is that I think we all need to think hard about what our readers, or certainly my readers, want to consume. And sometimes both myself and the people who give us stories, be it sources or public relations people. Sometimes I feel not quite thinking that through quite straightly enough.
Yeah.
So I do despair slightly that some new homes builders are still sending through new home stuff by the bucket load every day. I do wish, if I could say one message today, is please stop. It's delete all the way around. But from a wider picture point of view, I do think it's been fascinating for the property industry, and potentially also, having done some interviews with people who are moving home, fascinating for people all the way through the chain, because they're having to think about moving home very differently. They're having to think about what is home very differently, and they're having to think about how they achieve their next move very differently. And that's changing technology, that's changing the house chain, I think, to a certain extent. And also it's changing the way that estate agents operate. That's definitely true. And if there's one thing that I think is likely to change immensely after this crisis, is that estate agents, I suspect, if not just for the medium term, will probably not be operating in the same ways they used to before. For example, I don't think that face-to-face viewings are really that necessary any longer. After 3 months of probably doing them using digital technology, the consumer is going to wonder why you do face-to-face. I know estate agents say they're important. However, so that's where I am with that.
Yeah. Is there room for, I've got a question here from Lizzie Milne at Spider PR. Are case studies going to be shaping a lot of content? For example, buyers that have progressed with a purchase during this period, people who've had to wait and cancel. Are you in demand for kind of human material case studies?
I'll pitch in. I'll definitely say yes, but be careful, because there are a lot of consumers and estate agents out there who get very irate if you're seen to be doing stories which somehow are persuading people to go out and contract, so to speak, to buy and sell homes. So long as the case studies are clearly labelled as pre-coronavirus started, that's fine. That's all I'll say.
Yeah. Well, as she says, are you kind of crafting things along the lines of when some form of normality is resumed or restored, wouldn't place X be a great place to live, or is that just too impossible at the moment?
I'll let someone else answer that one.
Okay. So that's one for the rest of the team. Okay, Nigel, thank you for your initial thoughts. That's great. We're going to have plenty more questions in a minute. I'm going to bring in next of all Nathan, if I may. Nathan is the Deputy Editor of House and Home in the Financial Times, the weekend supplement. Nathan writes, edits and commissions features on UK and international property and writes a monthly column called On the Market. He is coping with self-isolating by reading, including Means of Ascent, Home Truths, and a book called The Property Boom by Oliver Marriott. I'm glad that he is so optimistic. Nathan, great to have you with us this afternoon. What are your thoughts on what's happening? And also, can you give us some thoughts on how PRs can approach you at the moment and give you content?
Well, I think a lot of, I agree with a lot of what's been said. The impact has obviously been incredible. If you look at any metric you want to fish out, I mean, start with probably transactions and the way that they've dropped off. Then you can, you kind of, if you pull out, you can look at the sort of secondary and tertiary. Searches on Zoopla are down 40, 50%, something like that. Yeah. The number of inquiries are down, the number of sales properties being put up for sale is down. So, I mean, and our advertising is down as well. So it's obviously a huge impact. As to kind of how we claw ourselves back to some kind of normality, we talk a lot about the V-shaped recovery and hope that there's been this kind of severe and violent impact to the market and that there's going to be some sort of opposite and equal reaction. I think there is going to be demand, and I think that's very, very important. I think we'll see a lot of advertising spend and a kind of a rush of stories as we come to the kind of tail end of these restrictions, these shutdowns. But I think that is really going to be predicated on how well the government manages its exit strategy from these restrictions. You can imagine that if there is some sort of problem, if these are withdrawn too quickly, or if there is some kind of second wave of the virus or something like that, that you're going to see an impact on market sentiment, and then you're not going to see that recovery. You're going to see a much more drawn out period of kind of economic stagnation or recession. So I think that's an important thing to look at. I think that probably our most powerful early indicator is we can look at the markets in China and in parts of Southeast Asia where they've kind of got over the kind of worst of the virus.
Yes.
There was a chart from Knight Frank, I think this morning, which shows transactions increasing back in China. It's not a V-shaped recovery. It's not quite at the levels that we were trading at before in sort of September, October, but there is an increase. So I think that's a kind of a thing to keep in mind, and be very vigilant about this sort of return to normality and how we cover it. I think broadly what PRs can do in this situation is, and I think a lot of it's already been kind of addressed, but incidentally, the way that the Knight Frank have been giving daily updates, I think, has been very useful, because it's sort of, they're not trying to sell stories. They're not kind of new build developers just kind of flooding you with, we've got this launching, we've got that launching, despite the fact that no one can actually buy a property, as Nigel mentioned. But it kind of acknowledges the fact that we don't really know what's going to happen, and so we're looking for early indicators, and it kind of shares that information with you. So I think they're doing a very good job on that. Yeah. When it comes to case studies, I think that they are always important, but I think they are incredibly important now. And the reason why I say that is because we've got to. I know it's difficult, but we've got to kind of keep in mind that the coronavirus story is not a story of a property crisis. Is a healthcare crisis first and foremost. And so if you are, when we are kind of developing our stories or commissioning our stories and putting them out there, we have to be very sensitive about that, very careful with the way that we present stuff. And I think that you don't want this, certainly if we're doing the kind of aspirational international property purchases stuff that we tend to do. So you've got to be very careful with that. And so I think that a good case study, one that is timely, one that is sensitive, goes a great deal, because what we're doing is we bring out the human struggles and the way that people have struggled against trying to buy a property in this time, or how the setbacks they've had, or the successes they've had, or the ingenuity they've had, or whatever. And so I think that's a really neat way of getting around the fact that perhaps, property is not necessarily a lot of people's primary concern in such a dangerous and difficult time.
Well, that's a great summary. Thank you very much indeed, Nathan. Got lots of questions coming in, but I'm going to now turn to Ruth, who is, I think, the last of our panelists to speak. So Ruth Bloomfield has spent over 10 years as a property freelancer, following a lengthy period as a general news reporter, news editor, mostly at the Evening Standard. She writes for the Standard, the Independent, the Telegraph, Sunday Times, How to Spend It, Wall Street Journal, many others, on everything from first-time buyers to subprime sales. She's twice won the Property Press Awards Overall Journalist of the Year title. That's an award ceremony now run by Property4Media, and she keeps winning individual categories as well. She says that her time during quarantine, her time off, is mainly devoted to her very spoiled horse, Fleur. And she tells me that if PRs are nice about Fleur, then she may in turn be nice to them. So ask Ruth daily how Fleur is getting on is I think the big takeaway from today. So Ruth, what's your take on this, and how can PRs stay in touch?
Hi everyone. Well, I mean, I can sum it up in just one word. The impact's seismic. Never known anything like this. I've been a journalist since I was 21. In terms of how the papers are changing, you've heard from others, but I mean, I can tell you, as an example, the Evening Standard, as you know, Homes and Property used to be gigantic, 20, 30, pushing 40 pages at times. They're now, I think they'll have 6 or 8 every week for the next few weeks. who knows afterwards? It depends how the story develops, it really depends on we don't know. We've not got a clue what's going to happen tomorrow, let alone in a few weeks. There is only one story in town, and everybody has to be aware of that. Nobody's interested in, stories about like lovely places to buy a country cottage, or the reality of living by the seaside, or top spots to, buy a holiday home. People are dying, and this is the worst crisis I can remember. And those jolly, frivolous, happy stories, they have no place at the moment, and it's really inappropriate it's just really inappropriate. I think the only property stories that matter at the moment are things that offer some practical help and assistance to people in their current scenario. And that's like how they cope with having, a house full of teenage kids back from university and all milling around being a nightmare, to, what they can do now. I think the answer to that question is very, very little. Yeah. Yes, you can stalk the portals and maybe make some kind of a short list of properties. But the problem is that until we're only in week 2, it's just too early to call how this is going to develop. If we're on top of it in a few weeks' time, I think it will almost be a blip. It could almost be a blip. People will go back to work, furlough will end, everybody will just say, oh God, that was weird, and carry on. But I think it's going to last a lot longer than that. And I don't think that confidence will return to the market, and we all know how important sentiment is, until either there's a vaccine or we have real evidence of the famous herd immunity, and we can feel safe again. Because at the moment, I think even if the restrictions are lifted, by early summer, I'm wondering how many people will feel confident to buy a property, not knowing if it's going to recur over the winter. I think buyers are always very nervous, and they almost look for reasons not to buy. And I think a lot of people who've been sitting on the fence for ages with Brexit might think, oh, well, we could sit on the fence for another bit longer. I think what companies should be doing is thinking about what they can do to assist in this current stage that we're at now, and going forward, looking at the resources and the expertise that they already have. Partly because I think that's the right thing to do, and partly because I think that creates some feel-good factor about them as a business, which I think is important for trust, and so on. So there we go. I've had a lot of time spent in the garden.
Yeah, very good. Ruth, is there a slight difference in approach depending on the frequency of publication you're writing for? So the nationals you write for want, hard and direct, up to the minute news, but are the long leads beginning to say, well, I still need to think about the world after coronavirus, or are they just not?
How to Spend It now doesn't have a property special until September. Okay. What they'll do, because there is a very long lead time, so how they'll play that, whether they'll push it back, I don't know. I don't think anybody wants to attempt to second guess this situation. Yeah. The London Magazine has halted production for its May-June editions, which I think come out in April, May. Who knows what they'll do beyond that? But it's all going. With all publications, the issue is advertising. Advertising is king. Yeah. So everybody will be waiting. When advertising comes back, the supplements will come back. Yeah. And the magazines will come back, and everything. And there'll be greater demand. I can't imagine any property company advertising while nobody can physically get out of the house to go and visit their offices and see houses. I personally think the whole virtual viewing thing is a little bit of a gimmick. I think people might well go and have a look, because people are very bored, and they might not mind nosing around a development or a house. But I don't think many British buyers will buy without seeing. And I think we have to accept that a lot of people are now not in a position to buy because they've either lost their job, they're fighting to save their company, or or they're on furlough, they're freelance. I mean, there are so many of us people that were sort of encouraged to become freelance, and the help that the government's giving is not going to buy property in London, certainly. So I think it's pretty bad.
Okay, very, very clear answer. Thank you very much for that, Ruth. Okay, I'm taking a couple of questions now. Similar question from two people, so I'm going to join it up. Charlotte Treadwell at Carrow Communications and Lisa Jolly from Liberty PR. They're saying, maybe one for you, Helen, is there more of a focus now for things going digital rather than print? Should people be targeting your digital channels?
Well, yes, we did always want that. And we've definitely seen that. I mean, there are fewer ads, fewer pages, fewer people going out to the newsagents. The supplements are small. So we're definitely looking at going digital first. Like Nathan and Nigel and Graham were saying, we've all seen spike in digital figures. They come to us for constructive news. That's what I was saying about. See, we want to be in the hard news pages. We want constructive news. And we also do want some escapism. That is beginning to happen. But it's a very, very difficult tone to get right. And I'm puzzling over that. But in terms of, we do want to go digital first. But again, it's not necessarily that different. What is the picture? What is the story? Why are we doing it? Why is it relevant? How can it help? To me, it's weird, like the intensity. I have done far less cleaning, far less gardening, far less of absolutely everything since this thing started, because I've been working remotely and it's just that much harder. And there's so many fiddly things to do. I haven't done anything. And I'm really cross at all these other people who have learnt the harmonica or something like that. I'm cross. But no, digital for sure. I think digital, what that allows us to do is to go into a bit more detail sometimes, is to offer, say, 2 case studies when one wouldn't work. There's less of an emphasis on the picture because you don't have to have a cover story. But like everything, and I really agree with what Nathan was saying, it's about knowledge when it comes to the PRs. It's not what have you got, how does it fit? It's about the expertise that you might have with your agencies and your kind of clients on your new build, and someone just being able to articulate what is happening in the market, and trust it.
Yeah. Okay. No. Very, very good.
Can I just add to that briefly?
Yeah, Nigel, please.
Which is just one thing I've noticed during this crisis, and I think probably Graham has noticed as well, is that on the trade publications, one big difference is that one has been a huge increase in traffic. I mean, certainly for the trade, and I suspect also for the online consumer as well. The other one is that people are chasing stories around because they're sat at home reading stuff online. And I feel a sort of more competitive atmosphere because what used to be in print and would take a day or a month or a week to get to the presses and get published is now being accelerated by this crisis somewhat. And for example, the Negotiator magazine is having to rethink how it does stuff because the online news stories are just happening too fast for it to be relevant to the magazine. So, and that's just something I was consider. Yeah, sorry, that's what I want to say. Yeah.
We've got Holly at Ebury Communications saying, Helen and Nathan in particular, what is your plan on international property at the moment? Are these stories on hold or are you open to approaches?
Shall I jump in first, Helen? Thank you. No, they're certainly not on hold. The Financial Times readership is international. We cover international kind of in a typical run when we're up at 5 sort of property stories a week. It will be 3 2 international to UK, and that doesn't really change now. In fact, it's probably even more crucial that we cover international property markets because this is a global crisis, and different countries are experiencing the crisis differently, and they are experiencing the kind of revivification of their property markets differently as well. So we just need to do it differently. You can't do a sort of lovely story about, I don't know, second homes in the Dordogne or whatever for Brits, and look at the tax implication or something, or whatever, or whatever the story might be, as something about pensions or golden visas or whatever. Let's not look at that yet. Let's look at how those international, how different cities around the world, different locations, different destinations are coping and recovering, and what they're doing to keep alive in this process.
Victoria, actually, sorry, Helen, you might like to come in there as well. Helen.
Yeah, let's say very similar. I mean, obviously, when you can't send someone overseas to look at a development and write about it properly and judge it properly, we won't do it. Similarly, of course, if you can't go and visit it, we won't. That's not to say that there is this level of escapism that people are still looking for. So but you would then go and be very extreme, like wish you were in lockdown here and there's 10 million plus or something. So it's so fantastical that you can just about get away with it. I would also look at following the markets. Manu's doing something for us next week, looking at the main markets, probably the US, France, Spain, Italy, and the Far East, what's happening there. And then case by case basis, when Italy suddenly plummets, if it does plummet, there will be people who will want to know if the prices are lower than they've been for more than a decade and will consider buying in. So it's a bit more gruesome and grubby as a topic, but we would definitely consider covering it.
Very good. So Emma from BECG raises a good point, as well as saying great session, thank you. She says, are the journalists open to feel-good stories about developers going out of their way to support owners and communities with extra efforts?
Yes.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, very much.
Graham, what's your answer on that?
Yeah, I think, well, I mean, and in answering this about developers, I'm also answering this about the rest of the trade, i.e. agents and suppliers and everything else. A critical thing for them is to emphasize that they're doing things in their areas and they're doing things for their communities, and their community can be the sort of client they have, or it can be physically the community where they're based. And it's not because it's a feel-good story actually, but it's because it's a story of them trying to connect with their community and do things whilst there is a period of lockdown or whilst there isn't much trading activity. And that's quite important, not just because it does provide stories, but because it gives a level of continuity to some of these organizations. Some of these get exposure day in, day out in the trade press. When they die completely for 3 months or 4 months or 5 months or however long it's going to be before we can buy and sell houses again, they disappear off the scene. So from their perspective, it's very important to get a level of exposure. And if and I'm not being unduly cynical here, but if the only way they can get exposure is by showing off at what they're doing in their community, then that's a good thing.
Very good. And you've championed this in your pages, haven't you? You've actually devoted.
Yeah, we did a few days ago, we did sort of good deeds that agents did, trying to buck the broad trend of what agents are like and how they're perceived on a wider basis. This coming weekend over Easter, we're going to do things about agents working from home and photographs of what they've done and tips that they've got to other agents and so on and so forth. So in other words, there's clearly going to be, I think, a shortage of really significant stories in a few weeks' time. For the last couple of weeks, and I think this applies to the consumer press as well, there's been a lot of stories about, can you move house? Can agents still operate? Will virtual tours sell or not sell? All of these things, and lots of government announcements. So the last couple of weeks actually has not been difficult to find stories for. But I think the next couple of weeks, once we're in a pattern of not a lot happening, will be quite difficult. So things like that, I think, would be really useful.
Okay.
I think there's a comparison between property and sport, which is they're both running out of miles, so to speak, when it comes to what they can report on a little bit.
Yeah. Nice. Sorry, Helen, go ahead.
I was about to say, we, to some extent, have almost have too much to say as well. That's we're looking at the digital first, trying to do it almost daily. The sort of the nature of home, when it's not a property investment, has never been under more scrutiny. So, you know, how you use your space, what you do in it, whether you're doing it up, what you might want to do to it, making it work for you, even if it's just turning it around and saying, we're doing on Sunday about zoning, you know, how to make the home work for you and your family more. But I agree with Graham, we're reaching a time that there's lots of room for those stories right now, but in a week or so, or 2 weeks' time, it is nerve-wracking. I don't know what we're going to put in the pages. But good deeds always do get on. So we launched a Good Neighbour competition at the weekend, Sunday Times Good Neighbour Award. And I would say that's good. And just to help brands in general, our News Corps have been doing weekly insight sessions with all the main advertisers and reader panels. And what's become quite clear is how brands act now will be very relevant. So people will remember if you do something wrong. And I think they may find themselves paying more than they thought they would.
Victoria Eltis at 4 Communication says, will there be a surge of home studies in new build show homes after all this? The way that the epidemic is changing the way we work in our homes. Does that work for the sections?
Nice try.
I don't think so.
Nice try, but on a more serious note, I hope it will make new home developers sit up and realise how to design and build better, healthier, happier homes for people if they get stuck in them for 24 hours a day.
Yeah.
Not just not just the sleep in. I think that the way which you build a new scheme will have to be taken much more seriously, because the virus or the idea of a pandemic is now not going to go away, and it could come back every winter.
Yeah, that is very true. So we've got Sam Smith at Liberty PR wants to know whether virtual tours are kind of just going to be a gimmick for this period, or whether you as editors are going to be demanding more virtual tour content in the future. Gimmick or long term?
Depends.
Gimmick.
It is a gimmick, but I think it depends which market you're talking about. So I think probably for buy-to-let investors, virtual tours will become a thing, I think, because if you're, and I suspect for people who are doing first, they're doing the filtering during the buying process, like, is this just, do we bother turning up to do a viewing on this? I think that virtual viewings have definitely got a role. I think as Ruth said, I think for the real stuff, is this got the right feel for me? It'll never replace it, but it's definitely got a role in the initial stages of home searching.
Yeah,
I was about to say, I can see that. I think the buying public might also try and demand that the process of buying and selling gets shorter.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
The difficulty now is that there is a huge pent-up demand, but could be anxious and nervous. But if they knew they could actually get through the process quicker, they might be more confident about making a purchase. The idea that there are so many people in the chain, it involves, and it takes 2 to 3 months when you don't know what can happen, is nerve-wracking. So hopefully this will be a bit of a wake-up and speed that process up, because I think there's more people who might actually want to move. They'll be more interested in making the move than they are in the value of their house.
Yeah, I would completely agree. Whether or not virtual viewings are a gimmick or a long term or whatever, I think it's slightly besides the point. I think what you are seeing is just a symptom of an industry which is going to have to become much more comfortable with being in what you might call the weightless economy. Much more comfortable using things like powers of attorney, but also things like video conferencing, things like virtual tours, these kinds of processes, because the property market is incredibly slow and kind of encumbered by endless ancient kind of bureaucracy. So I think it is just part of a wider trend. So
very good. Vicky Goodall at P1 Communications asks, is retirement residential property of interest to our panel at this time, especially if stories are angled and relevant to the ongoing debate? Are there any parts of that sector that you're interested in at the moment?
Well, there's a very interesting argument as to how a retirement sector, if it consists, one development consists of every individual in it being locked down as they would be now, how does that function? Everything that retirement specialist developers have put forward as the advantages of these locations have actually turned into a disadvantage now, because everybody in there is vulnerable. They're not allowed out. The facilities they can't reach. So a lot of these things that were the plus points are the minus points.
Yeah, but hopefully we're seeing good Samaritan stories from that sector of the developers going the extra mile to help, maybe.
Oh, absolutely. But I think in a sort of a wider term, I mean, we're getting into, you know, more speculative society-wide issues here. But in another sense, you could say that actually a mixed community, where you've got young people, where you've got people of all ages, you've got working people, retired people, and everything else, might actually be better. So I think on a very practical basis, and I know exactly why PR people will put this forward, and of course they've got to, because their clients expect them to, but it is a double-edged sword, I think. And I think the last few weeks have exposed things like retirement communities as being much less of an answer than some people think they might have been.
And I would add, also as a freelancer, obviously I'm pitching stories to kind of everybody all the time, that forget coronavirus, there is very, very little appetite for stories about retirement. And to be honest with you, I think it's because cute young families and young millennials just make nicer pictures. I'm sorry to say it, but I would, if you look at any paper in normal times, and it's not just property, it's every part of it. You don't get many old people in the paper unless it's Donald Trump.
Yeah, no, we're definitely trying more because our readers are aging, so there is a definite market. But once you've done one slightly bland retirement-only gesso for the 90-year-old, what more do you do? Again, it's got the same basis as any story. What's interesting about that one? Why does that deserve to be in?
Yeah. Well, sounds like that whole sector may need more effective PR.
Well, it's not the PR that is the issue. I think Graham spelt out the issues. Yeah. It's definitely not the PR that's the problem.
Yeah. It's the product.
It's the product.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, very, very good. So one from Steph from Camargue. Are we likely to see readers becoming more interested in the way the property industry works, particularly if councils start to engage with digital planning consultations? Is there a need to explain processes and the role that readers can play in their areas? Is there someone who'd like to take that one?
Well, I've worked on lots of local papers and covered many, many planning meetings. So I will say, yes, of course. But we're at a very early stage yet of that. When it starts happening, yes, we will definitely have to, readers, all our NIMBY readers will definitely want to know how they stop next door building an extension and how they protect a listed building in their area. Yeah. But at the moment, we're not there yet. That's not a story. I don't think in the grand scheme of what's going on at the moment, people are that worried about it.
They're not, but then we did something in the weekend just to mention that this had happened, and as I think you have to be invited into it. But there is an awareness, which is where the PRs can fit in to some extent, is what is happening that isn't being reported or isn't making it to the main news pages. Sometimes perhaps we ought to be aware of that and pick that up. So, or it might be in a month's time, a guide to all the other things that happened that you just didn't read about because you were too busy doing something else.
Good question here, a fair question, and it's got to be asked by Jonathan Rowland of Ramweb. He said, is there interest in amongst any of our panelists in quick buyers and chain brokers who are still buying, or is that merely seen as cashing in and you can't touch it?
I'd want to, it would have to be stood up very well. Yeah. I'd like to know about it if that's what's happening.
Yeah.
But I still don't think that those are people who are coming in cold. That's the thing.
I think the main problem with that market, and correct me if I'm not entirely correct, but my understanding of it is that it is not regulated. certainly not regulated properly. And that's why a lot of, in my experience, a lot of websites and magazines veer away from it, because, to put it bluntly, there's some fairly lovely people who run these companies. They don't make for great copy, because it's very hard to find anyone who's got a heart, who's involved with underpaying people for their homes in order to get a quick sale.
Fair enough.
Yes, the piece would be very much more on the consumer angle. So how to be aware if you get a leaflet in your house, or if you found someone targeting those in potentially, for example, a lockdown retirement community with things, to try and get rid of them or something, you know, like, we very much want
that. Sharon,
sorry to give him that feedback.
So a question from Legit Immobilier in France, Sharon Scott, just wondering if the panel have any thoughts on how this can all impact people buying second homes and making the move to Europe. We've had the panel kind of reference this earlier. We saw a large surge at the beginning of the year with people wanting to move before the end of the year, Brexit. Can we expect further interest in the move to Europe once we're clear?
Well, I think that you're going to see a lot of pent-up demand for all kinds of property purchases, and all types of agents and developers who are selling kind of second home stuff around the world, kind of Sunbelt stuff. So I imagine that a lot of the advertising, kind of half in hope, half in expectation, will be pushed towards this to the summer, later after the summer and the autumn, and you will see a kind of an increase in things like the amount of stories that we run on these kind of things, the amount of supplements, because it will just naturally fuel a bit of a sort of a self-fulfilling kind of cycle of interest. Whether or not that actually translates into a rise in second home sales in kind of European destinations, I mean, I rather doubt it, actually. I think there'll be a good few weeks of escapist stuff and thinking, oh, maybe there's actually, you know, the prices are looking pretty competitive now, maybe we should do that. But then, of course, weighing against that is we've just had a period of intense disruption to flights and travel. It is a virus which has been spread by the incredibly liberal way that people travel around the planet. I feel like there is also a lot of drag that's going to kind of minimise that sort of any flurry of interest.
Okay. Good question here from Yasmin Triana at Rooster. She says, are you seeing are you in demand for stories on home improvements, people getting their houses ready now that they've got time and they're at home, getting their houses improved and making them ready to sell when they get the all clear? Are you interested in home improvement stories at the moment?
If my street's anything to go by, where 3 houses are being currently done up as we speak by builders, so that seems to be one industry which sidesteps the guidelines. So there you go. So yes, would be my answer.
Yeah, I think, no, absolutely. I think that's what I mean by pent-up demand. I think I can't think of the letter D, but there's going to be a new type of buyer. There are many that are going to be very nervous, but then there's others that would just literally be, damn it, I want to do it now. Like, they're so fed up from Brexit, or so fed up from too many people in too small a house, they will decide to make their move. Yeah. And I think that they want to make the move more than they want to hang around to get the highest possible price for their London home or something. I think this has given us, all of us, an extraordinary opportunity to reevaluate how we live our lives in our homes, and what we might see as more important. And depending when that comes out in the housing market, it will result in different moves and different things done in homes.
The story on Homes and Properties website that's had the most hits since that this began was a very straightforward piece looking at where you could still buy home improvement paint and paper and so on online. It was absolutely head and shoulders above it, everything else. Clearly, people have got plenty of time to look at their home and realise it's a bit drab and they hate it, and plenty of time to physically go and do things to it because they're, you've got nothing else to do, whether people are going to take the next step of starting to think, wouldn't it have been lovely if we had an extension, or we'd done the loft, or we reconfigured the whole place. It's going to depend on finances, and at the moment we simply don't know how many people are going to be how badly affected by this. We also don't know in which economic group they're in, as in, are wealthy, affluent people who can spend a couple of $100 grand on doing up the house. Are they going to be okay? In which case, the answer to your question is yes. Or are they going to be hit along with the people who work at Costa? In which case, it's no.
Yeah.
Any other input on that one? Okay, I have got Helen from Putt Brown. Interesting question. Really enjoying this afternoon's webinar, finding it really helpful. Following on from the comments about the retirement sector, what are the panel's views on the build to rent communities and the benefits that can offer once we come out of lockdown?
I hate it. I'm sorry, I feel I can say that as a freelancer. My views are not anybody else's. I think this whole concept of a premium rental product, which is more expensive than private renting. I know it's got advantages, and you get free Wi-Fi, and isn't that lovely? And there's maybe a roof terrace for you all to share and have barbecues on when, maybe one day. But the fact is, you can take that money and you can go and you can rent somewhere in the same area for considerably less money, even once bills are included, and that's just a simple fact. I think it's great for students who don't know London, for people who have got a contract to work in London short term and they haven't got the time to look, or maybe people coming from overseas for a contract, they haven't got a clue. It's just easy for them. So for that small group of renters, but your average generation rent, money is really important to them. They are savvy enough to deal with landlords. They're desperately trying to save deposits, and huge numbers of them, certainly in London, are going to be trying to pay off their credit card bills that they've built up during furlough because they've got no money, and they're just not going to go out and want that premium product. And I would be embarrassed to be plugging it.
I can also point from a marketing point of view is that really the industry hasn't come up with a defining difference between itself and the rest of the private rental market. There are plenty of landlords who have houses just as posh as build to rent, which, as Ruth says, are probably cheaper. And I've seen figures showing it's 20%. Anyway, that aside, it'd be really good if someone came up with a defining difference, which could help journalists, because at the end of the day, the readers don't care there's a difference between build to rent and the rest of the private rental market, because it's a sort of technical trade difference in their eyes. They don't really see it as something, I must have build to rent. That makes it quite hard to write about, because for a consumer, there's nothing to hang on it.
Good. Okay. We've got one from Holly at Ebury. Are you interested in hearing about ultra high net worth individuals and how they're transacting at this time, or is our panelist focused on mass market?
No, we're
will be
in high net worth, Financial Times, and if you can show a trend or a movement among that tranche of the market, then absolutely, always.
Yeah, trends and statistics.
I think this comes back to some extent to one of the things that we were talking about right at the start of the webinar, and that is the appropriateness of what is sent by PRs to journalists. And I can absolutely agree, Nathan, this is bread and butter material to Nathan. But when you get a press release through, as I did on yesterday, in fact, I got one through from Embargo for Today, and it had about 3 lines given to the mainstream housing market, and then a huge swathe of research about prime central London. Now, I can appreciate that there will be some sectors of property journalism that will thrive on that, but an awful lot won't. And I just think it's probably sensible. And I do appreciate it. I'm going to go back to the same point I made about retirement journalists, that was wishful thinking on my part. Retirement developments. That I can see that there are clients pushing PRs, and PRs are keen to please clients because everybody's up against it at the moment. However, I think you've got to think how this is going to be seen by the recipients of certain press releases. You know, if we all to do with property, if we received a press release now from some motor manufacturer saying there has never been a better time, but next week to buy a car, we would laugh at that because we know there are many better times than However, when we get the same thing out about property, you know, it jars, and I can see why PRs are doing it. But in my opinion, things like high net worth purchasing or services for, as we had a press release, and probably all of us received the same press release early last week saying people who are unable to get to their investment properties in London and they can't be sure they're secure, they should make sure they get extra insurance for it, and so on and so forth. I mean, for goodness sake, have a read of this. Think what it says about you and your client, actually, when you come back. It's much better. I'm not going all soft and fluffy, but it's much better to say that that client is doing something and giving a few grand to an NHS cause than it is to read that they're really, really, really concerned about high net worth individuals who live in Dubai unable to get to their properties in London. It's a hobby, and I'll get off it.
I got that one. It was just embarrassing for whoever said it.
The curious thing is, if I can just say one point on that, is that I personally do feel that, and I think when you work in the sector, you kind of defend it, and you don't want that. You know, we do have a nice image. You then give what high net worth individuals do to the news desk, and they go bonkers on it. And then it's proven by the position it's given in the website that all the country are very interested in reading it too. Who would have guessed that quite as many people were interested in Daniel Daggers as were last November? And that was one of the most read stories.
I think the most interesting thing, one little case study which shows these points that we're all making was what happened to Rightmove last week. And it took a business decision which a year ago or 2 years ago would have been absolutely fine, and there would have been a bit of muttering in amongst estate agents about what they'd done, and then it would all pass and we'd all move on. But to, you know, a large PLC, not only that, a large global had to suddenly change their mind and do a complete U-turn on how they treat their customers. And that is, you know, that's earthquake stuff in our industry. The Rightmove to it's wrong and do a U-turn. So just that's, I think, a nice illustration of where we are in terms of how you do your moral compass on your press releases, because that's what's happening in the business bit of the industry.
People will remember.
Very good. I'm just going to wrap up with two very quick ones. A quick yes/no answer from the audience. I've got Rebecca at Instinctive Partners saying, given that we've all become a lot better at video conferencing, are you open to virtual meetings with agents, house builders, property portals, if they've got, a thumbs up from Nigel. Thumbs up from Helen and Ruth. Graham's fine with that.
Graham's uncertain about that.
Graham's
that's a bit more uncertain, thank you.
I mean, there does need to be a need for a meeting rather than just have a meeting.
Yeah. And Nathan, how do you feel on that?
Yeah, totally. Absolutely. If a meeting is warranted, then by all means, let's do it via conference.
But if not, the telephone does still exist. And I'm going to wrap up with a final question to the audience. I think it's a good one, with asking you each for a prediction. This is from Lizzie Milne at Spider PR. She says, do you think the effect on the property market from coronavirus will be similar to that in 2008, or will it bounce back more quickly? Now, there is a tough question. Ruth, could you start off with your answer first?
Well, I'm an optimist, so I say more quickly.
More quickly from Ruth. Helen?
There's a head and hand moment there. I think it can. It all depends on the time of the lockdown, like we said at the beginning. I think it really could bounce back much more quickly, but it will behave very differently in different parts of the market and in different parts of the country.
Yeah, you spoke very passionately earlier about the pent up demand. So hopefully, when it bounces back, it'll bounce back strong.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot there. But again, if you can speed up the way in which we buy and sell, it will help. If the government did something on stamp duty, which they might now consider potentially after lockdown, that would help.
Yeah.
You know, then I think people, if they showed an appetite to move, would want to see support from everyone else involved to help them make that move. Fantastic.
Nigel?
I will say what one agent said to me last week, which was during the 2008-7 whatever crisis, the point was the banks cut off the cash to the industry, to the consumer, to the house buying process, and it came to a grinding halt, and everyone started chasing each other for money. And he said the difference here now is that that's not happening because it's not like the banks cut the money off. It's just everything's gone completely dead very quickly in a couple of weeks. He was therefore optimistic that once the taps were turned back on and people start going out in the streets and start looking for houses again, it will be relatively fast compared to 2008.
Yeah.
And Graham?
I think it will bounce back more rapidly, but I think the market will be quite a different shape. People will have different priorities as to why they move, what they buy, and where they buy.
Okay, very interesting. And Nathan?
Well, I mean, I don't want to take up too much time. I'm slightly of the opinion that the 2008 financial crisis really hasn't even been resolved yet. So a slight problem with the premise. But I think if you're talking generally about kind of prices and a return of transactions, I think we're looking at, I think it's certainly going to be quicker than the 2008 crisis if the government can negotiate the withdrawal of the restrictions successfully.
Okay, very, very helpful. Well, a huge thank you to all our panelists today. It's been a great webinar. I've really enjoyed listening to your thoughts. I'm sure the audience has too. Thank you enormously to our audience out there for all your questions and for tuning in. Come back to us with your ideas, input, spokespeople as mentioned, but an enormous thanks to our panel and to Ash Pearson at Property4Media for managing all the technology behind the scenes and keeping this all going perfectly. So thank you all very much. I'm sure Nigel will play us out to a Larkerson, like that, something appropriate. Thank you all so much and good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.